Hello and welcome to, this is episode 75 of the Everyday Spirituality podcast. For those of you that have been listening for a while, we've been listening to the audio chapters of the book Everyday Spirituality, but periodically I like to take a break from that, which is what we are doing today with a conversation with Anna Woofenden, who is the author of the book, This is God's Table, Finding Church Beyond the Walls. And Anna is a pastor, and right now she is serving one of our congregations, Zion Lutheran Church in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Welcome, Anna.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be able to have this conversation, and it's been a joy to serve at Zion. So I'm glad to connect with the broader Lutheran Synod folks as well.
Yeah. We should ask you about Zion too. I forgot to mention that because in an earlier podcast, I had the former pastor who kind of led through that whole redevelopment process on too. And now they're in an interim, which you're helping out with. So Anna, before we get in and talking about the church that you founded and this book, which is just delightful and a really easy read, tell us a little bit about yourself, because you have an unusual background for people who listen to this podcast, coming from a denomination that I did not even know about until a month ago.
Sure. Well, I was raised on a small island in Northwest Washington, and kind of back to the land parents, connected with the earth. And, I learned to garden when I was quite young. And then my religious background, my grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents on both sides of my family were part of the Swedenborgian Church, which is a post-Reformation Protestant group that was founded around the theological writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. So many people have never heard of it. We're very small. And there are 30 volumes that Emanuel Swedenborg wrote. So similar to the Lutheran tradition, you can't really say like, oh, well, this is the thing, or this is the one marker point. But the Swedenborgian tradition, some of the things that kept me in it or had me return to it after having it in my family roots, or just this idea of the breadth of God and the warm embrace of God. Swedenborg was kind of radical at his time, saying that there could be many paths to God, which I think many of us now, that's not a very radical statement, but at the time it was. And also that there's deeper layers of scripture, and that we can read scripture and find God's voice in our own lives. So those are some of the things that this small little tradition that many have never heard of, that I was born into and continue to walk in some of those theological ways, has offered to me, and was really part of some of the inspiration of founding the Garden Church. And I guess that the third piece I might point to, which specifically with the Garden Church, which we'll talk about in a minute, which the book is about, is that Swedenborg talks about this idea that the physical world, the natural world, is infused with a spiritual reality, that God is present in and amongst and beyond all that God has created, and that just invites this connection with God that we can find when we are together with other people, and also when we are outside or we have our hands in the dirt. And that continues to be a guiding light for me in my ministry and in my own spiritual path.
Yes, and that idea was radical for his time. He's 1700s England, mm-hmm. I think. Yeah.
Sweden, actually.
Sweden, and then, Sweden. Okay.
Yeah, but then there wasn't any organized group until about 30 years after his death, and that did start in London, England. So.
That's right. That's what it was. There were pastors that were meeting in London. Yep. But he is from Sweden, so therefore Lutherans will claim him by ethnic association.
He was born Lutheran, so right. I mean, he died Lutheran. I mean, I don't think he had any intention of a denomination starting.
Nor did Luther.
Right. So.
But that idea, I think, is radical for its time, because it's a very non-dualistic way of thinking about spirit and matter. And he, from what little I know, and I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg, but his writings were quite radical in terms of that spirituality that was very incarnated matter. And that connects with you growing up, your family, back to the Landers, but that was also something for them that was just not just a 1960s, the hippies back to the land. That was part of their faith, was it not?
Yeah, I think there's connections certainly, and I look to both my maternal and paternal grandparents, especially my grandmothers. Wherever they lived, they were always gardening. My paternal grandmother was my grandfather was a clergy person, a minister, so they moved around a lot. And there were always stories about how she planted a garden wherever she would go. And so I think that while in my childhood, it wasn't maybe as explicitly linked or articulated, I certainly feel that was in the fabric of the family tree, is this faith piece and this connection to the earth and to growing your own food and cooking and preserving and providing, and that those two had something to say to one another in daily life.
So then after your seminary education and the various churches that you served, you can start to see why the idea of a garden church would come to fruition. Tell us a little bit about how that idea of garden church was planted inside you before it became something that got planted in a vacant lot in San Pedro, California.
So, I mean, I've had this hunger for what does it mean to be fed by God and fed by one another. And throughout seminary, throughout my life, but particularly in seminary, I really was looking at the sacrament of communion or Eucharist, and what does it mean to take this bread and this cup and bless it and name it and share it together, and does that feed us? And then how does that connect to this physical need that we all have to eat? And how does it connect to those who don't have access to food? I did an internship with Bread for the World, which is a ecumenical lobbying group in DC. Actually, it's interreligious now. It began as ecumenical, it's interreligious. And I was my eyes were open to the amount of food insecurity and food justice issues that there are in this country, and of course, globally. And became very committed to advocacy, and also noticed that I wasn't called to directly spend my energy on Capitol Hill, though I'm so glad there are people who are, that I wanted to find out, like, how do we connect what happens in the sacrament and around the table with the needs in the community. I was really blessed to do my internship in seminary at St. Gregory of Nyssa Episcopal in San Francisco, where they have a food pantry that's in the big rotunda of their beautiful sanctuary. And so on Friday afternoon, it's basically like a pop-up farmer's market, and 400 or so families come through and get their food for the week. And then on Sunday morning, in the very same space around the table, that same consecrated table where share the Eucharist, that the worship service takes place, and people are fed spiritually. And so my mentor, Sarah Miles, gave me this question to wrestle with, which is, what is the connection between the liturgy, if you will, on Friday, when the families are coming through to get the food, and the liturgy in a more traditional sense on Sunday morning? And the Garden Church really grew out of that question. How do these interlock? How do they connect? And what happens if you throw in growing the food too, right? So the Garden Church is in San Pedro, California, on the outskirts of Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles. It's in the city of Los Angeles. And she took this empty lot and created an urban farm and an outdoor sanctuary where we could work together and worship together and eat together. And all that happened around that God's table. And God's table at the Garden Church is a big old cedar log stump that consecrated that first day when we opened the gates. And this book is a story of what happens when you try to mix all those things together and feed in body and mind and spirit and what might God do with that?
And all of the people that come in and out of that experience gathered around that cedar stump that you planted, along with some other people, and that God planted with you and others, including this. One of the humorous things is, so you get this vacant lot that you're able to rent in San Pedro, and one of the leftover occupants of the vacant lot is one of the first questions that you and your folks need to wrestle with. Are we going to allow this occupant of this vacant lot to remain? You want to tell us a little bit about who that occupant is? I think
that's right. So in this vacant lot in downtown San Pedro, there is a 14 foot metal dinosaur painted green, which is a leftover from a sculpture sale that had happened a number of years before. It was not in my aesthetic plans for this outdoor church that I was going to plant.
It obviously wasn't in the plans of the sale from the leftover art sale, because nobody bought the dinosaur.
Nobody bought the dinosaur. But the dinosaur had become beloved. I think it had been there for 4 or 5 years prior to when we started, and to the point where, so there's these big gates. It's a gated off lot. I mean, people couldn't go in there. Occasionally it'd be rented for various events, but generally this dinosaur is behind bars. And so people would call it the Dino Lot or Jurassic Park. It had become an icon. There were some people even who felt like who called it kind of the protector of the block. There was a love and affinity for this garish, I might even say ugly at times, though now beloved dinosaur. And so, but we really wrestled with it because it actually takes up a sizable corner of the space, and wasn't within our plans and aesthetics, but I think made very much the right decision to say, Dino is here. It's a part of the community, and it's a sign of saying, we're not coming in to try to change people, but to try to offer something and to be in and with what is in the community. And so Dino has continued to be a protector of the space and an icon for the Garden Church. And one of our members, and this happens to this day, including in COVID, has taken to dressing up Dino for the liturgical seasons. And so if you go on the Garden Church's Facebook page, one of the things you can find is, Dino with angel wings, or Dino with a crown of thorns, or Dino has a mask, by the way, COVID safe. I mean, Dino really keeps up with the times. So it adds some good humor to the space as well.
I looked through the Instagram account and got a view of the whole evolution, including Dino, and the contributions that people make in protecting it, and then when it falls over, putting it back up, and all that kind of stuff, and so forth and so on. So you start with just a few people, and you tell us the story in the book. This is God's Table, which is really the whole story of the church, the founding, the various people, the kind of the motivations, and you weave in these biblical narratives into what happens over the course of your 4 years that you were there. Thoughts on, I want to ask about the writing of the book, but we'll do that towards the end. What are some of the different aspects in this book that would resonate with people that listen to this, to read this? And this is a book, by the way, for clergy, for lay people. This is a book that really is quite readable, quite accessible. Thoughts on the book and what it's done?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I was listening to a few of your episodes, and of course went straight to the garden episode from Everyday Spirituality. And I would say that this book is a story of a church, right? So it's a story of a collective. It's while my story is intertwined in it, it's the primary character of this book is this church. And so I sometimes think of it as an invitation for what does it look like to be church or to do spiritual practice in various ways. And so I might say, in the way that it might connect with everyday spirituality is, you're giving these opportunities like, here's some different ways to do spiritual practice. And I think this book is the companion to say, And here's what some of those ways look like. So specifically the garden church, I mean, certainly looks at, obviously gardening and earth and eco-theology. But it also, a big marker point of the character of the garden church is that it is a place where people of different paths and walks of life come together, and particularly socioeconomically. That many of the members are unhoused and living in the neighborhood, be it in a tent down by the post office or in the alleyway, and mixed in with people who are housed and live literally up the hill, and that's both economically and geographically. And you have downtown lawyers and teachers, and it's the real mix of people. And so I think that I see it as an invitation into one's own spiritual practice. So if you're interested in what does it look like to garden and to work in that way with around your faith, but also it's an invitation to have our ideas widened about what it means to be church, and particularly across class and economic and living situation lines.
Do you think that the fact that it's a church without a building, how does that make it different than your quote traditional church plant?
Yeah. I mean, it makes it a lot harder in some ways, right? It means that the back of the pastor's car is, always full with things that you're taking back and forth. I think the freeing thing is that it doesn't look like a church. And so there's a barrier of accessibility that is removed. And there are people that walk in who would never walk into church doors, be it because their own experience with religion that was not a positive experience, or for many of our unhoused members, indoors is not necessarily a safe and welcoming place. Indoors often has struggles with having to prove your need or asking for something, or people are incarcerated, or, I mean, there's just indoors is complicated. And so I think that being physically outside there was an invitation and a literal openness and a figurative openness that was just afforded to us because of our context. I think another thing it does is that if you want to be connected to the earth and to the weather and to the seasons, and if you want your liturgy to be infused with kind of an eco-theology, there's really nothing better than actually being outdoors, because suddenly you realize, oh, it's hot today, or it's raining, or it's windy. And this is something I think many of us have experienced in COVID. Zion, we're doing the driving in the parking lot, and the congregation are safely in their cars, but I'm out in the elements, and which is fine. I'm happy with that. But
it's one thing to do that in San Pedro, California in December. It's another thing in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in December.
It is, though. One of our mutual colleagues, Steph Smith, who founded Cathedral of the Night here in Northampton, I'd filled in for her last February, and I was like, okay, this is hardcore. Like I've committed to outdoor church, but this is a thing. And I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for those opportunities, because it connects us to nature, but it also connects us to the people who are living in outdoors. And so I think that our context for church matters, and it changes things. People often ask, oh, the garden church is a reimagined church. It's a church start. Your liturgy must be like really, they always say like really creative, like really innovative. And I say, well, no, I mean, really, we start with an opening song and an invocation, and it just moves through. And there are certainly some things contextually that we tried to do, but what was different was the context. And I think that's something really powerful to remember, is that our liturgy can hold us. The prayers and the rhythm that the faithful have been doing throughout time hold us. But the context does change the way that we can hear it and experience it. And so to be outdoors can inform us in a different way about things that we thought we knew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I have my own dream of kind of a version of wild church, but that'll have to wait a couple of years for my own work. And so one of the things you do really well in the book, I think, is you weave in these different biblical narratives. And I want to lift up, I think it's in chapter 4, I think it's the feeding of the 5,000, and you're struggling on a particular day with the question of, are we going to have enough food? Because what you would do is you would work together, worship together, and then eat together. That was that's the liturgy of the day. And not everybody came for all three of those. I loved how it was 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. But people entered at various points, and you weave in the feeding of the 5,000 into this experience of scarcity. Can you just talk about that? Because that was my favorite chapter in the whole book. I love that whole chapter.
Yeah, well, so the story I tell is that so as you can imagine, small church, a few volunteers, trying to put on a full meal every week was a bit of a feat. And so there were many days where I was afraid there wouldn't be enough. And we had a blessing song, which was written by my colleague, Carrie Meyer. And the words were inspired by Wendell Berry piece of writing. But the words are, there is enough, there is enough, there is enough, and some to share. And often we would sing those blessing songs, and I would sing them as this like prayer and this like claiming like, okay, God, like, I don't know how this is all going to work. But one day this fifth grader came in, and he had to do volunteer hours for his fifth grade class. And we started him working in the garden, and he was not super thrilled about that. He was very polite, but he was not thrilled about it. And I said, well, we need people to cook. Do you like to cook? And his eyes just lit up. And he got together with a few of his other fifth grade classmates and made this incredible meal. And it came on a day when we kind of needed that reminder. We needed that reminder of abundance. And it connects so beautifully with that story of the feeding of the 5,000 and how this little boy brings 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And the thing that struck me in that gospel, and I'd love to hear what connected with you in this, but one of the things that struck me was that Jesus had the people bring the food to him, right? He had the loaves and the fish, and he blessed them, but then he gave them back to the disciples to distribute. That there was this mutuality of sharing and of abundance. And it just connected so beautifully to me with this little boy who brought, chicken and pesto chicken and a nice cake. And a story that's not in the book is that so this is now six or so years ago. His fifth grade class, which is they're now in high school, are continuing to do the meals, including in COVID, family by family, takeout. It's all takeout container. So and so this feeding of 5,000 has literally probably at this point expanded out to be a feeding of 5,000 from this little boy who said, I can do that. That would be fun. And how about my friends do it too?
Oh, that is beautiful. And that continues to this day. That is just beautiful. I have always, what connected for me is years ago, I preached on this feeding of the 5,000. And what I said was to a congregation of a mixed variety of perspectives on interpretation of the Bible, one range to the other. And I asked them, I said, look, could Jesus kind of go boop, 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 magically make enough? And some of the heads nodded. And I then made the case that the real miracle is that Jesus changed people's minds from an attitude of selfishness to an attitude of selflessness and sharing. Yeah. And so that fits in with your mutuality. That's, if you want to rate miracles, which one is greater, changing human minds or miraculously reproducing? My experience in life is changing human minds and hearts is much more of a miracle. So that's what connected for me. And then to hear the story that this young boy, now young man, is continuing it through high school, that's wonderful. What was
Well, I
it
think
like?
that that's
Go ahead.
scarcity and abundance. I mean, just to further your point on the scripture, that it's so easy in a church planting situation, and honestly, a church in general, and working with people who are struggling socioeconomically, that the orientation of scarcity is not unfounded, right? That there actually are a lot of needs, but to be able to also look around and say, but what do we have here? And I think that's one of the, when I work with church planters, that's one of the questions I ask before people even go into a location is, what are the needs, but also what are the resources? What's there? What are the things that are there? What are the people that are there? What are the, and I think this is true of our established churches too. Say, what do we have? And you find out that actually often we have a lot, but we haven't figured out how do we connect that to the need. And that's where the creativity and the curiosity comes in to say, oh, well, we have a little boy who doesn't like to garden, but loves to cook. Or we have, house neighbors who most of the day have to spend their time asking for things, but they come into the garden church and they're the expert on something. They can teach someone else how to plant a tomato plant or what things get watered in what ways. And that part of that miracle is that the loaves and the fish were already there. Like it wasn't like go to the village and here's some money and go get it, but they were already there. So I think that too, of that invitation of changing our mindsets to look around and see how is God already providing what's already there.
Yep, absolutely. Well, just to cap this little section off too, I want to tell you that I've come full circle. So in my book, I do talk about how my wife is the gardener, and if I have any role, it's leaf raking in the fall. But COVID changed all that, and last spring, I built raised beds and figured out a way to keep the deer out without, violating the space. And now we have a wonderful garden, and that we share in that. So I got converted.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, so that was kind of fun. Having written a book, I know it's a challenge. How did you do this? What was it like actually writing all of this down? Did you do it as you went? Did you have kind of a journal, or did you towards the end reflect on it and then write it? What was your kind of process in that?
Yeah. Before I even started, my mentor, Sarah Miles, said, you're going to write a book about this someday. And I said, who me? And also like, who has time? And she said, okay, here's the deal. Every week or so, send me field notes. So they can be fragments of sentences, of conversation. They can be bullet points. And that ended up being just a really beautiful and supportive process anyway, was to weekly, and it didn't always happen every week, but most weeks to, often I would do it on a Friday night or Sunday night after church, and just say, here's what happened. And here's a bit of a conversation. And the book would not be what it is without those, because you think you're going to remember all these stories and you don't. And you think you're going to remember that bit of dialogue that was just like, and you don't. So I had all of those field notes, but I didn't start writing the book until after I'd left the garden church. So I transitioned out at the end of 2017. And then I had about a year and a half where I was doing non-geographically bound ministries. I did some consulting. I was doing some work in Boston. I was doing some work at a UCC church in Ohio, and there's a couple moves in there. And while that was, there were some other pieces of that career-wise, which is hard to have many part-time jobs. But the gift was I had some space to write, and so for about 6 months of that time, in an intensive way, I was able to carve out time to write every week. And most of the book was written in Gambier, Ohio, at the little coffee shop there. And I think it was, for me too, it was also, planting a church and then transitioning out of it there was a lot of feelings too. There's a lot to process. And one of the gifts of writing was it gave me a chance to really thoroughly process through the beautiful good times and the blessings, and also the struggles and the challenges, of course, not all of which were able to be in the book, but I still got to go through that process. And so, and I also felt like one of the things that was clear to me in the call to plant the garden church was it was for the people there and continues to be, but also wanting it to be a laboratory for the broader church, a learning experience, not this is how all the churches need to be by any means, but hey, here's a way. This is a way we can be church, and wanting to be able to share that and to share, here's some of the things we learned. Here's some of the questions we asked. Here's some of the ways that we explored. And so I feel like writing the book in many ways, not in terms of my contract, but in terms of my call was the capstone of the call to be able to say, and here's the story in a way that can be shared. And of course, the story continues. The Garden Church is still,
I was just going to say,
growing and thriving.
Bring us up to date with what happened after you left and where it is now and what you know.
Yeah. So it is being led by the Reverend Dr. Amanda Riley and Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mitchell, who are co-pastors, and a Presbyterian minister and a Swedenborgian minister. And actually, we had a Lutheran pastor was in an interim period during the transition period as well. So it has beautifully become a very ecumenical project, which does my heart great joy. And they're continuing to work together and worship together and eat together. Of course, COVID has changed a lot of things. So they're worshiping on Zoom, but they have takeout meals every Sunday, and they are doing even more production and bringing vegetables to people's doors who might not have access. They've also started a second site that is primarily a farming site, so they can have a lot more production. And it's just beautiful to see how it continues to.
If people want to follow it, where can they go? What's the website? Or
Yeah, so it's Garden Church SP for San Pedro, and there is another garden church out there, which is not the Garden Church. So make sure you have the SP and on social media and Instagram as well. It's Garden Church SP for San Pedro.
And you have your own website, annawoofenden.com, and you do a Food and Faith podcast. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can find me at annawoofenden.com or on social media at Rev Anna Woof on Instagram or Facebook, or Anna Woof on Twitter. And then the Food and Faith podcast has been a really fun project the last 3 years. A couple of co-hosts, Sam Chamberlain and Derek Weston, and we have conversations with all sorts of people who are working at the intersection of food and faith. So from clergy to farmers to chefs to environmental activists, and people are welcome to find that at foodandfaithpodcast.org or Food and Faith Pod on all the social media platforms, and most welcome to add it to your podcast lists.
Absolutely. I will check it out. Well, thank you for being with us today. This was a great conversation.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for your continued work to lead the church in these difficult times. It's really, really appreciated.
Well, thanks, Anna.